Today is July 5th, the day that in 1852 Frederick Douglass addressed the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York. I want you to imagine yourself for a moment as a member of his audience that day, 168 years ago. You are there to hear Douglass, one of the national leaders of the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery, the movement of which you are a part too. And he speaks, as expected, about the evils of slavery. And yet, in asking what Independence Day should mean to enslaved people, in his rhetorical question of why he is even in front of you to speak of freedom, he does not excuse even you, an abolitionist, from being part of America's system of slavery. In fact, Douglass wants you to know that you are not living up to the values you claim. He talks about how you, an American, are proud of your country and your religion. He notes how you rejoice in the name of freedom and liberty. And yet, he remarks, you do not offer those things to millions of your country's residents. Putting yourself in the audience at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York on July 5th, 1852, how do you feel about the scathing accusations of bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy that Douglass levels at you? How do you respond to his fiery denunciation of your place in this savage nation? Do you get upset? Do you get defensive? Do you take it personally? Or do you recognize the valid criticism of a corrupt system, an unjust system for which you are not responsible, but of which you are still a part and from which you still benefit? A cruel system that your own values require you resist and dismantle. How do these words of Frederick Douglass make you feel? As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We are also called to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. At first glance, those might seem to be at odds with each other. After all, how can some social structure, some system consisting of people, be bad, let alone evil, when those people have inherent worth and dignity? Call it synergy, emergence, or culture. The fact is, no group of people is simply, well, a group of people. We can hold both truths at the same time. In one hand, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. In the other, that systems consisting of such people can be good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, kind or cruel, just or unjust. Indeed, we ourselves are part of such systems. And when such a system turns out to be bad, we must take care not to get upset or defensive or take it personally. Rather, we are called to recognize valid criticisms of a corrupt system, an unjust system for which we are not responsible, but of which we are still a part, and from which we still benefit. A cruel system that our own values require we resist and dismantle. Today, I want to talk about the police. I don't claim to be even remotely in the same class of speaker as Frederick Douglass, but I know that my words will make you feel a certain way too. So I also need to make clear that by the police, I mean our system of policing, not individual police officers. That's a really important distinction. The police, our system of policing, is more than just a group of police officers. Individual police officers are responsible for their individual actions, yes, but no single police officer is responsible for the system of policing in which they are embedded. And that's a really important distinction, because we must denounce our system of policing as corrupt and unjust and cruel. And in no way is that a blanket generalization that individual police officers are corrupt and unjust and cruel. Since we're using the metaphor of bad apples, let's go there for a minute. Suppose we have an orchard that is producing apples that are killing people. It's not many. There are far more good apples than bad apples. But it's still unacceptable that our orchard is producing apples that are killing people. So when we discover a bad apple, let's say we get rid of it so that it won't kill any more people. That's the least we should do. But it doesn't stop our orchard from producing bad apples. The problem isn't really the bad apples. Those are a symptom. The problem is the orchard that keeps producing bad apples, and until that is addressed, apples will keep killing people. Over the last month, we have seen protests over police brutality, to which the police have often responded with more brutality. As terrible and disheartening and depressing as the news often is, I trust that you are all sufficiently informed that I don't need to list all of the ways that police have attacked protesters, assaulted journalists, destroyed first aid supplies, damaged property, and generally made things worse than they were already. I have so many tabs open in my browser with news stories about all of these terrible events that it's given up telling me how many browser tabs I have open. And there isn't time now for even a summary of how the police have proved by their brutality that protests over police brutality are entirely justified. I will, however, give you one example. Given the sheer egregiousness and the fact that it happened in Aurora, Colorado, where I used to live. Last August, Elijah McClain was walking home from his job as a massage therapist when someone called the police to report that he was acting strangely. His friends say he was listening to music and dancing as he walked. 3 police officers responded, and after all of their body cameras were reportedly knocked off during a struggle, they held McClain on the ground for 15 minutes. The cameras recorded audio of him saying he couldn't breathe. He can also be heard sobbing, vomiting, and apologizing. One of the police officers applied a carotid hold that caused McClain to pass out for a time. When paramedics arrived, they injected him with a sedative. And while he was being transported to a hospital, he suffered cardiac arrest. He died a week later. Elijah McClain was African American and 23 years old. That's awful, but it's only part one. Last month, with protests growing over police brutality and the killing of African Americans by the police, McClain's death received new attention. One such protest in late June was attended by musicians from all over the US, gathering at a park in Aurora to play their violins in McClain's honor. As a teenager, he had taught himself to play the violin, and during his lunch breaks, he would play for the abandoned cats and dogs in an animal shelter, believing that his music brought them some comfort. And so a call had gone out for musicians to gather and play together. And that's what they were doing when the police showed up in riot gear and attacked them physically and with pepper spray. I don't have the words, so I'll borrow those of Frederick Douglass. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. This is why many of the protests over police brutality are lifting up a common call to defund the police. Now, we can get upset and quibble about the wording of this, which only serves to muddy the issue and maintain our system of policing. Or we can recognize that the phrase defund the police catches our attention and galvanizes our commitment in a way that a 3-paragraph manifesto that's been wordsmithed by focus groups and debated by armchair philosophers certainly would not. To be clear, defund the police is a call to stop overfunding the police by reassessing our priorities when it comes to what we mean when we say that we want safe and healthy communities. Police officers themselves, including Newport News Sheriff Gabe Morgan, recognize that the police are asked to do too much. And when social services are cut, the police end up filling in because there's nobody else to call. Police officers are not trained as mental health counselors or social workers or medical professionals or education specialists. But guess what happens when you call 911 in a situation that actually calls for somebody with that expertise and you get the police instead? You get people who show up who are armed and who know that their jobs are dangerous and who have been trained to see everyone else as a possible criminal. And if you think defund the police is extreme, well, it could always be abolish the police. That's what Camden, New Jersey did in 2013 when they could not reform their existing police department without simply getting rid of it and starting over. After which their murder rate went way down and their solve rate went way up. And it's what Minneapolis is now doing, following years of abuses of police power and failures to reform. So do we get upset by the call to defund the police? Do we get defensive? Do we take it personally? Or do we recognize the valid criticism of a corrupt system, an unjust system for which we are not responsible, but of which we are still a part and from which we still benefit? A cruel system that our own values require we resist and dismantle. At the beginning of June, the Unitarian Universalist Association issued a press release, which was affirmed at the UUA's recent General Assembly. It is entitled, "Stop Calling the Police and Start Eradicating Anti-Blackness." And it begins as follows. As we mourn the death of George Floyd and other Black people killed by police, and as we respond to COVID-19, which continues to disproportionately impact Black communities, the UUA denounces anti-Black racism and the inherent violence of policing. Police brutality is a symptom of white supremacy and anti-Black racism, and as people of faith and conscience dedicated to justice and liberation, we must name this truth. This is an invitation for all UU individuals and congregations to pause and do some deep reflection on the ways in which we are called to confront and combat these forces. The whole press release is too long for me to read here, So if you didn't see my note about reading it before this service, I would ask you to look it up on the UUA's website and read it after the service. To summarize it, UUs are asked to engage in a three-pronged examination of anti-Black racism. Truth-telling, by naming the ways it shows up in and around us. Repair, by actively building a better way. And resistance, by following the lead of Black organizers. And UU congregations are asked to develop alternatives to calling the police. And the UUA provides comprehensive guidelines to figuring out when and how to do that. Let's talk about this from the perspective of the break-ins we had here in our office building in recent months. Well, when our office manager, Kirsha McAllister, realized that someone had broken into the office building, she called the police. The first time, they were somewhat thorough-ish in checking the property, trying to take fingerprints and so on. After the first time, the thoroughness went down. And this is by no means criticism of the particular police officers who came to our office building. Rather, the fact is that crimes like this go unsolved and don't get the police attention that it would take to solve them. I think Kirsha probably did more than the police, for instance, to see if anything of ours that had been stolen was ending up in a pawn shop or on eBay. But again, there's a system in place that we're part of, even though none of us created it. In order to get money to cover our losses and damages from the insurance company, we had to get police reports on the break-ins. And that was a whole circus that required Kirsha to put in a lot of extra hours. Then, in order for the police to be able to respond to suspicious activity on our property, they told us that we had to post no trespassing signs. A lot of no trespassing signs. Aside from the cognitive dissonance with our street sign that says all are welcome, this caused us some heartache, as Kirsha, Joanne, and I talked about at a staff meeting. And this, by the way, was all before the police killed George Floyd. Would such signs on our property be giving the police permission to stop whoever they wanted? Knowing the racial bias of the police, would African Americans be more likely to be stopped, whether they were technically trespassing or not? What if, heaven forbid, one of those stops resulted, as so many have, in someone's death? How could we live with knowing that even in some small way, we had allowed that to happen? There are alternatives to the police. Basically, rather than the militarized police occupying some more Black, more impoverished neighborhoods like they were part of another war-torn country filled with enemy combatants, people just want their neighborhoods to be like the average white suburb. It's really not that unreasonable. Imagine that instead of police officers responding when someone thought that Elijah McClain was behaving strangely, someone trained in behavioral health went to see if he was okay and got him home safely. Isn't that the sort of world we want to live in, rather than the one where McClain was held down, blood cut off to his brain, injected with a sedative, suffered cardiac arrest, and later died? Imagine that instead of police officers showing up at the Wendy's where Rayshard Brooks was asleep in the drive-through lane, a social worker woke him up, realized he was drunk, and helped him to get home safely. Isn't that the sort of world we want to live in, rather than the one where Brooks was shot in the back and killed? Imagine that you have a brake light on, and it's a city employee who signals you to pull over and fixes your light there and then so that you can get home safely. Imagine that someone seems to be looking into the windows of the cars parked on your street, and you call your neighbors who are trained in self-defense and de-escalation, and they resolve the situation safely. Imagine that somebody is sleeping on a park bench and a city employee comes by to check that they're okay and see what they need to be safe. Isn't that the sort of world that we want to live in? What can we do to make that this world?